Hello, everybody. It's Wednesday, and just sending a short lecture out on the tail end of Chapter 5 in Pickstock and the first part of Chapter 6, 6.1. I should admit, neither of these is really going to be adequate to the task. It's going to be a little bit brief, and that's just the way it has to be this week, unfortunately, for various reasons beyond my control. But let's start off on page 152 and 153, which is where we left off last week in chapter 5. As I recall, I was hurriedly explaining the significance of painting as a way of really engaging with and bringing out the truth of something that you see. All right, and she describes this in terms of that image of Ely Cathedral in the last full paragraph on 152, and then referencing the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, the Paleolithic cave drawings in Lascaux, France. Let me just pick that up at the bottom there. This is why, according to Merleau-Ponty, Upper Paleolithic man, as at Lascaux, felt compelled to overcome both of these inadequacies in the new event of painting. The two inadequacies being, one, the lack of clarity in my sense of the cathedral or anything that I see because of the limits of my sense vantage point, right? It's going to be relatively fuzzy. There are going to be limits to my senses no matter where I stand vis-a-vis the thing. I can never see it quite as it is. So limitation there, or inadequacy there in terms of my senses. And then the second inadequacy that painting tries to overcome is the inadequacy of my imagination, right? So again, these are both developed out of the end of the previous paragraph. My imagination is never quite as good as the cathedral is either. Right? It's always more than what I imagine. When when I'm looking at the thing, my senses are inadequate. I imagine when I think about it, even looking at it, I'm trying to build it out into all that it is beyond what I just sense of it. Right? I'm always doing this. Can't help but doing it. If I'm looking at any one of you, right, I have a certain sense register of you, but then I'm also, if I'm really thinking about you, I'm trying to build out all that you are in my imagination beyond what I just sense right now. Like, for example, if this is the way you look straight on, what is the other side of you? I can't not imagine this in some degree. Okay, but both my sense register there and my imagination of you are both deficient. All right. That's what painting tries to respond to. It tries to overcome both of these inadequacies. And this next sentence now. A fine picture, then, would constitute the best instance of a truth which one could possibly come up with, in excess of either the externally seen or the internally imagined reality. So somehow this engagement with painting, which is creative, that's the important thing, overcomes both the limits of senses and imagination. It's more than just imagination, because I'm actually reaching out and trying to do better than just what I have in my mind, right? And creatively give an image. I mentioned hurriedly at the end of class last time Monet's haystacks at the Art Institute of Chicago as an example. All these images of the haystacks, right? And Monet also did this with the cathedral at Rouen. He has another series of 20 different 20 different paintings of the same cathedral church at the same, different times of the day, different seasons and everything. Same thing with the haystacks. What is he doing with those? He's trying to catch something about the haystacks or the cathedral that fills it out more than just what he can sense and more than just what he has in his mind when he looks at the haystack. Something that expresses part of the haystack and sort of creatively fills it out. And he paints a bunch of different instances of that, a bunch of different takes on the haystack, for example, different times of day, etc., and year, because he never gets to the bottom of it, right? He has this ongoing creative engagement with the thing that is continually trying to bring out all that it is. That's what painting tries to do. That's, she says here, is one of the best instances of what the truth encounter is, of what we are doing when we're trying to elicit truth. It's this kind of creative building out of our sense of the thing. Okay, just a little bit more now. It will reveal, this engagement, the invisible serpentine line, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, after Henri Bergson and Félix Ravissone, of a portion of reality itself, which necessarily means its serpentine continuity and kinship with all other realities. What is he talking about? Now, what's all this stuff with serpentine? I wanted to explain this. This is one of the main reasons that I'm adding something at the end of chapter 5, because the serpentine thing is utterly baffling, but I think important. She writes about this in her other book. She writes about this in her other book, Repetition and Identity. A lot about this serpentine thing, which is why I understand it. What this fellow Ravissone says, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the 20th century philosopher, echoing him, is that in the encounter with reality, truth is not just giving an image of, my mind and my kind of creative apprehension of the truth is not just giving an image, a representation of the thing that I see, but it is repeating it, this whole non-identical repetition thing, in a new way that it hasn't been repeated before, and thus adding something to it, like Monet adds something with each haystack image that he gives. These philosophers refer to this as serpentine in the sense of the serpentine trail that a snake leaves behind it. It goes like this, right? Like a sidewinder in the desert has this serpentine path. In what sense is that like identical repetition? Well, it's continually going back over what it's continuing going back and forth through what it's kind of continually going back and forth through the terrain that it's covered before while moving forward, right? It's continually going back and repeating, but also repeating in a new way. So for these folks, that serpentine track is kind of an image of the way there's both continuity and novelty in truth encounters over time. This is how, Monet, as he paints each new haystack, adds more to our sense of what the haystack is. Undulating, right, is another word that she uses in the next section. The bottom of 154, she talks about the good is appointed an undulating pathway to a transcendent horizon. At the bottom of 154, about 6 lines up, same thing, same idea. This sort of undulation. So that's just one conceptual way of pointing to what she's trying to talk about. Good. There's a little bit more on 153, and I'm almost done with this chapter. Top of 153. For the defining overall shape of a thing, which compels us, in the case, for example, of a sculpture by Barbara Hepworth or Henry Moore, these are two 20th century sculptors, is elusively suggested by all the forms and angles which do appear, and yet do not in themselves coincide with the whole. Therefore, in seeking to draw out from the sculpture its missing coherence, one is at once trying to say what allows it to stand out from other realities, yet also promoting an extension of the sculpture into further sculptures which might continue to fill the surrounding landscape. What's she talking about now? Saying a dynamic sculpture, and don't worry about Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore, this is true of any sculpture, is a dynamic sculpture that has kind of movement and sort of, has a dynamism, kind of energy to it, is always pointing beyond itself and gesturing beyond itself and setting up potential relations with the things around it, right? So if you've ever seen, for example, Michelangelo's David, Bernini's David is what I'm trying to think of, who is, about to hurl the stone at Goliath. His very action is pointing to a whole world beyond himself, right? The shape of his body, the intentionality that's all built into it, all pointing beyond itself to this potential world, which whenever we behold it, whenever we encounter this, we're always building it out more and filling in that missing coherence and extending the sculpture into further sculptures, as she says, which might continue to fill the surrounding landscape. We do that all the time, not just with sculptures, with each other. Right? We're always filling out a world around each other, and better or worse, like more accurately or less accurately. And this is the encounter of truth. Right? Perception is therefore inseparable from a reception of form as a particularity that also holds of itself a universal potential for variation. Whenever I perceive things as true, whenever I have this kind of creative truth encounter, I see them in their particularity, and yet I'm trying to fill out what's all around them. But of course, I see the same statue, that David statue where he's throwing the stone at Goliath. In different times, I'm going to fill in different things around it, right? It's going to be suggestive in different ways. And of course, with people in the world, this is even more true. And so that's what she means by there's a kind of quote unquote universal potential for variation. There's a continually unfolding truth potential. Let me start that over again. There's continually unfolding potential for development in each of us, in the being of each of us, and everyone who sees us and knows us kind of unfolds new dimensions of truth that we have within us, right? It extends who we are by the way that they know us. That's the idea. The reality of any entity is an event which it realizes by concealing itself, and this very concealment is its impenetrable solidity, its holding in place as a thing in the world. Each of us goes into the world concealing all that we are, right? But like whenever somebody comes to know us, to see the truth of us, to encounter us really, they're trying to bring out something that's hidden in us, and express it in some way through their knowledge of us. In such a way, what is solid is paradoxically empty and of itself. In order to be and remain itself, it curiously depends upon an extension, a non-identical repetition. So whenever we're encountering the world, we're always bringing out what the things are that we see, and making them more themselves. We should perhaps, in this case, as Rowan Williams implies, understand thought as a continuation of this baffling feature of the real. whereby one's thought seeks to supply what is missing in the thing in order to be true to it, rather than regarding thought as a process of copying. So not copying, but extension or a supply of what is missing, bringing it more into its fullness. I read this poem to some of you after class the other day. I was going to do it the other day. I'm going to do it now. I think a poem by the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke might be the best example of what she's talking about here. So this is Rilke. Famous poem by Rilke is called The Archaic Torso of Apollo. The Archaic Torso of Apollo. I'm going to read an English translation, obviously. So this is written looking at a... Oh wait, this is not the poem. I'm sorry, it's not the poem I was going to read. What is the poem I was going to read? It is not that at all. It's actually just called by its first line, which is, "What birds plunged through." So this is a poem, excuse me, not about a statue, but about a viewer watching a bird fly and what happens when the bird flies. Okay, now listen to this. What birds plunge through is not the intimate space in which you see all forms intensified. Out in the open, you would be denied yourself, would disappear into that vastness. Space reaches from us and construes the world. To know a tree in its true element, throw inner space around it, from that pure abundance in you. Surround it with restraint. It has no limits. Not till it is held in your renouncing is it truly there. So, number of things happening there. But basic idea is, what are birds flying through when we see them flying? Not just through Newtonian geometrical code, empty space, but they're flying through our vision of them. And when we truly see them, we throw inner space around them, which is to say, we do what Pickstock was talking about. We fill in all, we fill in, so to speak, we kind of paint out all of the parts of their being in the greatest clarity that we can manage, and wrap them up with our imaginative, creative intelligence. When we do that, if we do it well, to the extent we do it well, we make them more truly what they are. Rilke says, not till it is held in your renouncing, like in your mind, is it truly there. Which is very hyperbolically put, and if we interpret it absolutely, it's problematic. But I think there's something true about it, which is just what she's trying to say, that in our perception, we make things more fully what they are. That's what the truth encounter achieves. And it does so on this basis that she's been arguing for this whole time, that thought is of a piece with the things we think about, right? I'm always already engaged in the form of the things that I think about, and my thought shares that form with those things, so that which have all their intelligibility written into them, which my mind is actively engaged with. And when I talk about them, when I think about them, when I try to say the truth about them, I extend that intelligible being and bring it out, make it more fully what it is, in the best way that I can right now. Okay, good. Let me just look. There's a lot we could say about 5.4, the true and the good. All I want to say for now is she affirms the unity of the transcendentals as part of her model. The unity of the transcendentals, meaning that the good, the true, and then being itself are all united in one. Look at how she expresses this on page 155 in the middle. Yet this is very simple. one simultaneously sees the spring wood to be. So she's thinking of like a stand of trees, woods in spring. We see it to be, to be good for anyone in the right sense is to be in, and to be a true manifestation of woodness, and so of being, of which woodness is an instance. And one sees it outside oneself and within oneself, and the wood as an occurrence or arrival. So goodness, truth, being, all these three traditional transcendentals, always together in the reality that we perceive, and a reality that is both inside us and outside us, right? We're standing in the wood, but we're also participating in it inwardly, in this encounter with truth. Guys, there's a lot more I could say about chapter 5, but I'm going to leave it there painfully. Let's look at the beginning of chapter 6. I'm going to try to do this in just 10 or 15 minutes, unfortunately, but the next 15, 16 pages. All right. Helpfully, at the start, she looks briefly back to what she's been doing and then looks forward and gives us a preview of coming attractions. So let's pay attention to that for just a moment. Beginning, page 158. In this book so far, I have argued for a realist theory of truth. I have sought to claim that the truth of things in one's mind is in accord with the being and truth of things as they are, and as they cohere with themselves and with other things. Okay, another reiteration of what we've already seen. By the way, don't be disturbed by all the reiterations, non-identical repetition, right? She's trying to make multiple approaches at the same thing, different words, different languages, different images, different thinkers. And she's intentionally trying to be repetitive, but to open it up in new ways with each non-identical repetition. That's what each of these chapters is doing. Okay, she's trying to do what she talks about. This claim would be endorsed by several contemporary thinkers, as we shall from now on see. What claim? That our mind and then the thing out there are of a piece in some way. All right. That's that realist conception in which shared world of mind and things is presumed, is something that has been absent throughout modern philosophy, that she's spent a lot of time going over in chapters 1 and 2, absent in those epistemological frameworks. What she's going to do from this point on is address several, especially in chapters 6, 7, and 8, she's going to address several thinkers who try to restore realism, all right? And who thus could make common cause with her. She's going to agree with them and like certain things about their projects, and then, of course, also separate herself in certain other respects before the last few chapters really bring home her view. Okay. So this is something endorsed by several contemporary thinkers, this restoration of realism. But for this claim to be upheld, a continuity of existence and mode of existence, as meaning between things as themselves and things as they are known, is needed. Furthermore, I will argue that accounting for such a circumstance is likely to involve the participation of both one's mind and the things one knows in a knowing transcendence. She thinks that some kind of Platonic vertical participation in the divine ideas is necessary. Some participation of both my mind and the things I know in the same divine ideas, shared, right, is necessary if realism is to held together. She said this before, just wanted to underline it again. All right. Next page, look at the first paragraph 159. In this chapter and the following 3, I wish to defend and expand upon this position in relation to 21st century philosophical claims to uphold realism, sometimes to offer a realist metaphysics. I shall do so first in relation to those arguments for realism which remain on an epistemological and subject-based footing, though they seek to ground human truth in human embodiment. Second, I will address the matter with respect to supposedly tough-minded ontological realists who deny that the given is a myth and who wish to insist on a hard difference between solid objects whose truth is independent of subjectivity and merely passive subjective observers. Okay, that was two things she said, and the thing you need to understand about that those two sentences, she's talking about what she's going to do in this chapter. The first part of the chapter, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, is is this argument, it's Dreyfus and Taylor that she's thinking of, who make arguments for realism while remaining, she thinks, in an epistemological and subject-based footing standpoint. Second half of the chapter, which we're going to discuss next week, 6.2 and 6.3, are the tough-minded ontological realists, and we'll talk about that next time. So that's preview of chapter 6, and then next sentence, chapter 7, I will consider speculative realists who seek to overcome this duality of subject and object in terms of a metaphysics of things. This is the one we're skipping, but I am going to give a preview of it next week. I'm going to give it like a short version of it, which she gives us. So that's chapter 7, speculative realists. Chapter 8, I go on to show how this attempt collapses into nonetheless instructive aporias, the things that the speculative realists that she addressed in 7 can't successfully do. Nevertheless, those failures point beyond themselves to opportunities, right? And instructive areas for engagement with her project, she thinks. She's going to do that, follow those out in chapter 8. Chapter 9, I consider metaphysical attempts which seek to uphold both subject and object, but to overcome their pernicious duality in terms of a shared degree of spirit and a shared transcendent origin. Those are people that she is going to approve of and like. Chapter 9, this French spiritualist tradition that I've been mentioning of Man de Biron, Felix Ravison, Henri Bergson, these types of guys. That's going to be chapter 9. She's going to be on board there. And then chapter 10, develop that further. In the third position, I shall endorse in the concluding chapter 10, this third position, I shall endorse the kind of spiritualist option in chapter 9. She's going to endorse in chapter 10, while also insisting on a variant of this position which gives appreciation to form as well as process. Analogical mediation as well as the mystery of unknown depth against some tendencies in recent negotiations to privilege the horizontal over the vertical, the possible over the actual, the unknown against an inkling of knowability. According to these aspects, so there's chapter 10, that's the last chapter, so there's a preview of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 there. According to these aspects of truth, I hope to insist on participation in eternal origin as essential to the recognition of truth in time. Thesis statement for the book, in some ways, I think, right there, that sentence. By going through these different aspects of truth, like the aspects or angles of a jewel, and approaching this subject matter from all these different angles or aspects, she hopes to insist on participation in eternal origin. That's kind of that Platonic vertical participation in divine ideas, as essential to the recognition of truth in time. If you want to have a stable sense of truth in time, you have to have this vertical participation. Okay, that's in a way the thesis, and she thinks she's making a bunch of aspectual arguments for it. All right. Last few minutes here, I just want to very briefly, unfortunately, discuss Dreyfus and Taylor and their attempted restoration of realism, which she thinks largely fails, although it's well intended. Okay, so she says in the first paragraph, the next paragraph, in fact, that in their book Retrieving Realism, they distinguish between contact approaches to knowledge and mediational approaches. All you need to know there is they're going to take the contact approach model, because they're going to try to eschew a mediation between subject and object, and just root their account of knowledge in a kind of direct contact between our bodies and the objects that we apprehend, right? So they're going to try to build up this kind of begin with this affirmation of direct contact, embodied contact with things, which then can become the basis of our knowledge. So they're going to try to do. I'm going to skip the next few pages because I think she rehashes some various challenges and problems of modern philosophy, which I don't want to rehash. Let's just start on page 163 and set up the problem a little bit once more that Dreyfus and Taylor are trying to overcome in their book, even though they don't quite succeed, she thinks. At the end of the second full paragraph on 163, she brings up an idea that she raised in chapter 1, and we didn't really give very much attention to this, but it's been implicit in our discussion the whole time. It's this fellow Quentin Melisseau, who is a French philosopher still living, his idea of the problem of correlation. This is the problem that these realists, these guys who are trying to be realist, are trying to overcome. What is the problem of correlation? It's just, how do I know that my ideas correlate with the world out there? It's just that same kind of what is between mind and world, or subject and object, or knower and known. Like, what is between that? How do I know that there is a correlation? So many of the thinkers in chapters 1 and 2 just had to presume that there was a correlation, and let's not think about that question too much because I don't know for sure. All right. So Dreyfus and Taylor are trying to overcome that, like so many people. How the gulf, last sentence in that paragraph, how the gulf between external reality and thought is bridged remains a mystery, even if the grosser mythical accountings for this mystery are refused. Dreyfus and Taylor wish to go further, to banish even the shadow of analytic mythology. To this end, they they critique the analytic philosophers on this, like that whole middle space. They, like Pickstock, want to avoid having that intermediary space. So how are they going to overcome it? Next page. First paragraph on 164. Dreyfus and Taylor locate this mental holism within the natural world in an altogether different way. They want to have the mind and the world in the same whole, as part of the same whole, like Pickstock does, right? Shared world. But how are they going to do that? This involves emphasizing the embodied and primarily haptic nature of thought. So again, something that Pickstock should be friendly to. She's very into the haptic. The way that we know things by touching them, haptic. By experiencing them in an embodied, sensuous way. It concerns the Heideggerian Zuhanden of effort and coping, rather than the Vorhanden of the propositional. Just to reiterate, Zuhanden is ready to hand, which means it's kind of enmeshed in our practices and our uses, like the way that we live with things, kind of in an embodied way, whereas Vorhanden, which means present to hand, as opposed to ready to hand, is more about, when things are Vorhanden, they're available to our theories, right? We're engaging them in a more theoretical, less practical way. So Dreyfus and Taylor want to do more of the Zuhanden, the practical knowledge. The way that we know things that way. Okay. It pays, their model, greater great attention to the fact that one's intelligence is first exerted pragmatically within the body as it finds its way around the world and adapts itself to Noé's affordances, to its channels of allowance, as when a child delightedly discovers that she can crawl through a tunnel or zoom down a slide. So we first know things for Dreyfus and Taylor by feeling them out with our bodies, right, in a way that is kind of down below conscious thought. And we're seeing affordances. What is this language about? We're seeing what the world affords us, what things let us do, so to speak, and we're kind of feeling out the limits, the characteristics of things, the way that they are, right, all the time. Pickstock would agree with all this, by the way. Next paragraph. Oh, I'm sorry. No, next sentence, sorry. Since nothing stands between the body and its environment, the truths of affordance and of both successful and thwarted effort can be regarded as truths of unproblematic, unmediated contact. Okay, that's the important thing for Dreyfus and Taylor. They want to say, there's nothing in between my body and its environment. I'm continually feeling these things out, and there's a kind of unmediated contact with the world out there, which is the substrate of all my intellectual knowledge. It's thinking about what my embodied knowledge actually is, my practical knowledge of things. But does mere invocation, next paragraph. But does mere invocation of one's incarnateness serve to remove the problem of correlation? Right? Have they really beat the problem that they're trying to address here? She doesn't think so. Dreyfus and Taylor wish sharply to distinguish modern from ancient contact. One's coping with physical reality involves for them no shared horizon of formed meaning or integral motion. They don't want to affirm that kind of metaphysical notion that I have the same eidos or form in my mind that is out there in the world, the shared form. They don't want to say that. That's too metaphysical for them. They don't want to be that bold. It remains the case for these thinkers, as well as other contemporary theorists, that there is a meaningful human knowledge of a meaningless natural reality. They claim, however, that this is rendered unproblematic by the situating of one's thinking within one's body, as if the clumsiness of colliding with a chair in the dark were somehow less likely to activate metaphysical aporia than the ethereal distance of a mental gaze. What's she talking about? So they don't allow that kind of metaphysical shared world. Instead, like other modern thinkers, it remains the case that there is a meaningful human knowledge of a meaningless natural reality. They don't really affirm whether the meanings are in things. They affirm that there is meaning in our human knowledge of them. So in the end, they're staking the entire case on the subject side, right? They're staking their entire case on what my body knows about the world through its direct encounters, and not any, and actually remaining agnostic about the metaphysical characteristics of the world out there, right? So they're not really, for her, solving the problem. They're still epistemological. They're still isolated on the subject side, right? Just like Husserl was, just like the analysts like Frege and all of us, all these modern philosophers from chapter 1 and 2, all isolated in that epistemological divide. So are these guys, because they're afraid of embracing that pre-modern metaphysical shared world. That's the main thing I think I want to say about 6.1. Let me just see if there's anything else I want to add. No, just to reiterate that, I guess, 165, second paragraph, first sentence. Were Dreyfus and Taylor to allow that, in the case of one's body, physical form and mental feeling and understanding were blended, then they would have returned to an earlier form of realism of contact, as contact with eidos. They don't want to say that there's, they don't want to say, they don't want to place the intelligibility out in things and the rationality, the logos, right, out in things. They want to just have it inside, in the mind. They want to take it seriously, but because they can't affirm the same thing, yeah, they it falls apart. Let me just take a couple more paragraphs and then we'll let it go. We'll leave it lying for the rest. Okay. Let me just keep on going there in that paragraph on 165. Such a framework nonetheless involves, as we have seen, a certain mediation by transfiguration of form itself. The framework that she's promoting, this pre-modern shared world idea. It involves a mediation by transfiguration of form itself. Same form transfigured, like from between my mind and things out there. In the case of the body, this happens through the conversion of organs into sensations. And once one has made the step of allowing that meanings may reside in the human body, nothing prevents one from supposing that there may be meanings in the physical bodies which one encounters, she says. So she's not talking about them now, she's talking about her own vision. Indeed, this would be plausibly consistent, though it would also constitute a return to a pre-modern realist framework, which she wants to make. The price of not returning to such an outlook, of restricting oneself to a perhaps less demanding modern mode of realism by contact, Dreyfus and Taylor, may be a contained banality resulting in the collapse of realism in the manner that I anticipated at the outset of this exposition. She doesn't think their model can work. It would seem that if one does not permit the conceptual literally to invade the corporeal, all right, if the body isn't actually thinking, and if the things out in the world aren't actually themselves speaking, so to speak, right, communicating like in the way that we have seen, then one remains within a dualistic framework, which is her, damning judgment on Dreyfus and Taylor. They're still dualists because they remain in the subject position. Object is out there. They haven't overcome the divide. Still dualists. Bodies respond instinctively in finding their way about the world. Minds later track and, as it were, mimic these resistances and affordances. They are translated into conceptual terms, which are perhaps disappointingly flat and observational ones. It can only be otherwise if one permitted the fancy. One could then claim to think by running, by dancing, by cooking, by throwing, etc. Otherwise, one only notices that one's body's instincts for successfully weaving its way through the world can be represented as logical. I'm not going to explain all that, but it's good. Okay. Guys, I think there's a lot more good stuff here. Okay, 2 more paragraphs, and then I will let it go. So far, I have suggested that the modern realist version of the theory of contact requires a dualistic framework, what she's been saying, Dreyfus and Taylor. But one could take a further step to suggest that it does not constitute realism at all. The problem with epistemological theories is the question of why it should be the case that the way things appear to one should be held to correspond to the way they are in reality, the correspondence problem. But one can also ask, why should the resistances to and allowances of one's corporeal efforts correspond to reality beyond the necessarily superficial way in which one encounters it? So the example here, I think, makes what she's saying clear. The blackberry bush, which I discover, is thorny on one side. On one side of it that I encounter may be thornless on the side that I do not encounter. Whenever I come to a thorny bush, ouch, I immediately presume thorny all the way around. I immediately presume a kind of unity. I build out the phenomenon. I build out my sense of the thing imaginatively all the way around it, and kind of figure out what it is from that judgment, that building out. And the same way with all of you, the same thing with all the things I know. Now listen to this. A certain rational faith would be needed to the effect that one's being inside reality, though through being in one's body and involved as a thinker in the body's formations and counterformations, as for Hume, Goethe, or Maine de Biran, affords one an insight into reality as such, in order for metaphysical realism to be established on this basis. Without such rational faith, no obvious realism would follow, beyond the banality that one's superficial encounters are true, as far as that goes. So, she's saying, and this is the point I'll end with, what Dreyfus and Taylor lack, and what keeps them in a dualistic frame, is they don't have a rational faith that they don't have the rational faith that that their embodied, that their complete embodied engagement with the world is a real engagement of my knowing body with things that want to be known and are calling out to be known, and that when I engage when I engage the blackberry bush, right, it is, so to speak, yes, I'm feeling one side, but it is giving me all sides of it, conceptually through my body, right? And it requires a faith, a certain kind of rational faith, to undergird the actions of reason that make generalizations about that bush or about anything. This is what, provocatively, she says, even Hume affirms in a certain way. I don't have time to go into that. Goethe and this fellow Maine de Biran. And then this is what she's ultimately going to argue for as well. Okay, guys, I'm going to leave it there. I will pick it up with the rest of chapter 6 next week. See you then.